Right now, something is quietly deciding who thrives and who struggles, and most people don't even see it happening. They blame the economy, the timing, the competition. But beneath all of that, there's a deeper force at work, one that determines your value long before the market reacts to it. You've probably felt it before. That subtle pressure of being replaceable. The sense that no matter how hard you work, someone else could step in and do the same thing. It's not something people talk about openly, but it shapes how opportunities show up or don't show up in your life. The uncomfortable truth is this: effort alone is no longer enough. You can work harder than ever and still remain invisible if what you offer is common. And most people never question that. They keep doing more of the same, hoping that eventually it will pay off. But the world doesn't reward what's common, it rewards what's scarce. It rewards what stands out, what solves problems differently, what cannot be easily duplicated. And once you understand that, everything about how you approach your life begins to shift. Think about why some people seem untouchable during uncertainty. While others slow down, they accelerate. While others wait, they act. It's not because they're immune to difficulty, it's because they've built something within themselves that the world constantly seeks. That something isn't obvious at first. It doesn't show up as instant results or recognition. It's built quietly over time through decisions that don't look impressive in the beginning. That's why most people never commit to it. They don't see the payoff early enough. Instead, they follow the crowd. They learn what everyone else is learning. They chase the same skills, the same paths, the same outcomes. And then they wonder why the competition feels endless, why they're constantly fighting for attention instead of attracting it. Because when you stay within what's familiar, you stay within what's crowded. And in crowded spaces, value becomes diluted. You're no longer judged by what you can do, but by how easily you can be replaced. That's where most people unknowingly trap themselves. But there's a different path, one that doesn't rely on being the fastest or the loudest. It relies on becoming rare, on developing a combination of thinking, skill, and perspective that isn't easily found. And once you step into that space, everything changes. You stop chasing opportunities because your presence begins to create them. People notice you differently. They listen differently. They value your input in ways they didn't before, not because you demanded attention, but because you became someone worth paying attention to. And here's the part most people miss. Rarity is not talent. It's not something you're born with. It's something you build intentionally. It's the result of choosing depth over surface, long-term growth over short-term comfort, and discipline over distraction. But building that kind of value feels uncomfortable at first. It requires patience when you don't see results. It requires focus when everything around you is pulling your attention in different directions. It requires commitment when quitting would be easier. That's why so few people follow through. They want the outcome, but not the process. They want to be seen as valuable, but they don't want to endure the phase where that value is still invisible. And that's exactly where the separation begins. Because the ones who stay with it, who continue sharpening themselves when no one is watching, eventually reach a point where they can't be ignored. Their presence carries weight. Their ideas create impact. Their work becomes something others depend on. And in that position, the rules change. You're no longer reacting to the economy. You're influencing your place within it. You're no longer competing on crowded ground. You're operating in a space where fewer people can follow. So if you've been feeling stuck, overlooked, or uncertain about your direction, understand this: it's not a sign that you lack potential. It's a sign that you've been playing in a space where your value isn't fully expressed yet. And once you begin to shift that to move toward becoming someone who is not easily replaced, you'll start to see opportunities appear in places they didn't before. Not because the world suddenly changed, but because you did. There exists a principle, unseen yet ever active, which determines the standing of every man long before the world makes its judgment known. It is not announced, nor is it recorded in any visible ledger, yet it operates with precision. This principle measures not how hard a man works, but the nature of what he offers in return for that work. It is here, in this distinction, that most men unknowingly limit themselves. A man may labor from dawn until nightfall, exerting great effort and discipline, and yet remain unnoticed. Another may apply less visible effort, yet command increasing reward and recognition. The difference does not lie in the quantity of labor, but in its character. For the world does not reward effort alone, it rewards usefulness that cannot be easily replaced. Most men are taught from an early age to value diligence above all else. They are instructed to work harder, to persist longer, to endure more than those around them. While these qualities are not without merit, they are incomplete. Effort, when directed toward what is common, produces only common results. It is not the intensity of labor that elevates a man, but the uniqueness of the service he renders. Consider how easily one man may be substituted for another in tasks that require no distinct thought. When the work performed can be duplicated without variation, the individual performing it becomes interchangeable. And in this interchangeability lies the quiet erosion of value. The man does not lose his ability, but he loses his distinction. It is here that many begin to feel what they cannot easily explain, a subtle awareness that, despite their effort, they remain unseen. They sense that their position is uncertain, that their contribution does not carry weight beyond the immediate task. This feeling is not without cause. It is the natural result of operating within a field where many offer the same service in the same manner, yet few pause to question this condition. Instead, they respond by increasing their effort, believing that more of the same will produce a different result. They work longer hours, take on greater burdens, and push themselves beyond comfort, all while remaining within the same boundaries of thought and action. And in doing so, they reinforce the very condition they seek to escape. For no man may rise above the level of his thinking by repeating the same patterns that have kept him there. The true measure of a man's worth begins to change only when he alters the nature of what he offers, when he begins to think beyond the immediate task, when he seeks not merely to perform, but to improve, to organize, to create. Then he steps beyond the field of the common and enters the domain of the rare. Andrew Carnegie, whose rise from modest beginnings to immense influence has been studied by many, did not distinguish himself through labor alone. He learned to organize knowledge, to see connections where others saw separation, and to direct effort in a manner that multiplied its effect. His value was not in what he did with his hands, but in how he directed the efforts of many through his understanding. This is the essence of uncommon service. It is not confined to a particular field, nor is it reserved for those of extraordinary talent. It is available to any man who is willing to think differently about his contribution. It begins with a simple shift from asking, "How much can I do?" to asking, "How can what I do be made more useful, more distinct, more necessary?" This question, when pursued with sincerity, begins to alter the course of a man's development. He no longer seeks to match what others are doing. He begins to observe where improvement may be made. He notices inefficiencies, gaps, and opportunities that were previously overlooked. His attention moves from participation to contribution. At first, these changes may not be recognized by others. The man may continue to operate within the same environment, performing similar tasks, yet something within his approach has begun to change. He is no longer merely completing work, he is shaping it. This shaping, though subtle, marks the beginning of increased value. For value is not always visible in its early stages. It forms quietly through repeated acts of refinement, through the consistent application of thought, and through the willingness to go beyond what is required. It is built in moments when recognition is absent, when effort appears to yield no immediate reward. It is precisely in these moments that most abandon the process. They seek confirmation that their efforts are being noticed. They look for signs of advancement, for indications that their work is producing results. When these signs do not appear, they return to what is familiar, believing that the new approach is ineffective. Yet the formation of value does not conform to immediate timelines. It accumulates, it strengthens, it prepares. And when it reaches a certain point, It becomes unmistakable. Others begin to notice a difference, though they may not be able to define it. They observe that this man approaches his work with greater clarity, that his solutions carry more weight, that his presence influences outcomes in a manner that extends beyond the task itself. This recognition is not requested. It is not forced. It is earned through the consistent demonstration of uncommon thought applied to common situations. The man who reaches this stage is no longer easily replaced, not because he performs tasks that others cannot perform, but because he performs them in a way that others have not considered. His thinking has become his distinction. His approach has become his advantage. And as this distinction grows, so too does his standing. He is consulted where others are instructed. He is sought where others wait. He becomes, not by declaration but by demonstration, a man of increasing value. It must be understood, however, that this transformation does not occur through a single decision. It is the result of repeated choice, the choice to think when it would be easier to act without thought, the choice to refine when it would be easier to repeat, the choice to develop when it would be easier to remain as one is. Each of these choices contributes to the formation of a new standard, a standard by which the man measures himself independent of external comparison. As he continues in this direction, he begins to notice a change, not only in how others perceive him, but in how he perceives himself. He no longer feels the quiet pressure of being replaceable. He no longer questions whether his efforts carry meaning. He understands, through experience, that what he is building within himself is not easily duplicated. This understanding produces a form of confidence that does not rely upon recognition. It is steady, it is internal, it is grounded in the knowledge that he is no longer operating within the limits of the common. Others will sense this. They will observe that he moves with intention, that he speaks with clarity, that he approaches his work with a level of thought that sets him apart. And in this observation, they will begin to assign value where previously there was none. Thus, the man who once felt unseen becomes one who cannot be ignored, not through force, not through demand, but through the quiet, consistent development of a contribution that carries weight. And so, let the individual understand this clearly. His worth is not determined by how much he does, but by how distinctly he does it. His value is not assigned by effort alone, but by the nature of the service he renders. And if he would rise beyond the uncertainty of being replaced, he must begin not by doing more, but by becoming more in the manner of his thinking. Let him then hold firmly to this principle and affirm within himself, I am not measured by effort alone, but by the distinct nature of the service I render. I cultivate within myself a value that cannot be easily replaced, and through it, I rise. There exists a tendency among men, so subtle in its beginning that it often escapes notice, yet so powerful in its effect that it determines the course of entire lives. It is the tendency to follow, not out of weakness alone, but out of the desire for certainty, for safety, and for approval. It leads the individual to walk where many have walked before, believing that the path most traveled must also be the path most reliable. At first glance, this inclination appears reasonable. For when a man observes others moving in a particular direction, achieving visible results and receiving recognition, he is inclined to believe that by imitating their actions, he may secure similar outcomes. He sees the surface of their success, but not the conditions that produced it. He follows the result, not the process. In doing so, he enters what may be called the crowded path. This path is not defined by any single occupation or field of effort. It exists wherever men gather in pursuit of the same methods, the same knowledge, and the same outcomes. It is formed by repetition without distinction, by imitation without innovation, and by effort that is directed toward what is already abundant. Within this path, competition increases while value decreases. For when many offer the same service in the same manner, the individual becomes one among many. His contribution, though perhaps competent, does not stand apart. It blends into the mass, indistinguishable from the efforts of others who have learned the same methods and followed the same instruction. This condition creates a peculiar form of struggle. The individual finds himself exerting increasing effort while receiving diminishing recognition. He competes not only against circumstance, but against every other man who has chosen the same route. He seeks attention in a space where attention is divided among many, and in doing so, he experiences the quiet frustration of being overlooked. Yet he rarely questions the cause. Instead, he assumes that the solution lies in greater effort. He works harder, studies more, and attempts to outpace those around him, but he remains within the same field, governed by the same conditions, subject to the same limitations. And so, despite his increased effort, his position changes little. This is the trap, not the lack of effort, but the misdirection of it. For no man may distinguish himself while remaining indistinguishable in his approach. The crowded path offers activity, but it does not offer distinction. It provides movement, but not necessarily progress. It gives the appearance of advancement, while quietly maintaining the individual within a fixed range of value. Henry Ford, before establishing his influence, observed this condition clearly. At a time when transportation was governed by established methods and accepted limitations, he did not seek to compete within the existing framework. He questioned it. He recognized that by following the same methods, he would produce the same results as those who had come before him. And so, he departed from the crowded path. This departure was not without risk. It required him to abandon the comfort of familiarity, to withstand doubt, and to proceed without the assurance that others provide when they travel together. Yet it was precisely this willingness to separate that allowed him to create something new, something that others could not easily replicate. The lesson is clear. Safety in numbers often conceals limitation. The presence of many upon a path does not guarantee its effectiveness. It often indicates that the path has become known, and what is known is easily duplicated. And what is easily duplicated cannot command lasting distinction. It is also within the crowded path that the habit of comparison becomes most destructive. The individual measures himself against those around him, seeking validation through relative position. He asks whether he is ahead or behind, better or worse, successful or unsuccessful, based not upon his own development, but upon the performance of others. This comparison diverts attention from growth. Instead of refining his own contribution, he becomes preoccupied with matching or exceeding the efforts of those beside him. He adjusts his direction based on external observation rather than internal understanding. And in doing so, he gradually loses sight of his own potential for distinction. There is a profound difference between learning from others and becoming like them. The former expands understanding. The latter limits it. The man who studies others with the intention of gaining insight may use that knowledge to refine his own path, but the man who imitates others without reflection confines himself to their limitations. He inherits not only their methods, but also their boundaries. To escape the crowded path, one must first recognize it. This recognition does not require withdrawal from all that is familiar, but it does require awareness. The individual must observe where his efforts are directed, and whether those efforts are producing distinction or merely maintaining participation. He must ask himself whether what he offers is easily replaced, or whether it carries a quality that sets it apart. This question, though simple, is seldom asked, for it requires honesty. And honesty, when applied to one's own condition, often reveals what has been overlooked. When a man sees clearly that he has been operating within the crowded field, he is presented with a choice. He may continue as he has, increasing his effort within the same conditions, or he may begin the process of separation. Separation does not occur through sudden change. It begins with thought. The individual must begin to think differently about his work, his approach, and his direction. He must look beyond what is commonly accepted and consider what may be improved, altered, or entirely reimagined. This thinking leads to action. He begins to make small adjustments, refining his methods, expanding his understanding, and applying his effort in ways that are not immediately obvious to others. These changes, though modest at first, begin to create distance between himself and the crowded field. At this stage, the results may not be immediate. The individual may feel as though he has stepped into uncertainty, leaving behind the assurance that comes from moving with the many. He may question whether his direction is correct, whether his efforts will yield reward, and whether the separation he has begun will lead to greater opportunity. This uncertainty is natural, for he is no longer guided by the visible movement of others, but by his own developing understanding. It is here that persistence becomes essential. The man who returns to the crowded path at the first sign of uncertainty abandons the very process that leads to distinction. The man who continues, despite the absence of immediate validation, begins to form a position that is uniquely his own. And as this position develops, others begin to notice. Not at once, but gradually. They observe that his work differs, that his thinking produces results that are not easily duplicated, that his presence brings something to the situation that was previously absent. This observation marks the beginning of recognition. The individual who once struggled for attention within the crowded field now begins to attract it. Through his distinction, he is no longer one among many, but one who stands apart. This standing apart does not isolate him, it elevates him. It places him in a position where competition diminishes, not because others have disappeared, but because he no longer operates within the same conditions. He has created a space in which fewer can follow, not by exclusion, but by the nature of what he has developed. Others will begin to see him differently. They will regard him as someone who possesses insight rather than mere ability, direction rather than mere activity. They will seek his perspective, value his contribution, and recognize his presence as something that carries weight. This change in perception is not accidental. It is the result of deliberate separation from the common path. And so, let the individual understand that the greatest danger he faces is not failure, but conformity without awareness. For it is not failure that confines a man, it is the unconscious acceptance of limitation. Let him then choose his path with intention. Let him observe where many gather, and consider whether that gathering serves his growth or restricts it. Let him be willing to depart when necessary, to think when others repeat, and to create where others follow. And let him affirm, with steady resolve, I do not follow the crowded path. I cultivate a course that reflects my own developing strength, and through that course, I rise beyond the limits of the common. There is a point at which a man must come to understand that distinction is not granted, it is constructed. It is not the result of chance, nor the product of natural advantage alone, but the outcome of a deliberate and sustained effort applied over time in a manner that few are willing to endure. This construction is what may be called rare ability. Rare ability is not merely skill. It is not the simple capacity to perform a task with competence. Many possess skill, yet remain unnoticed. Rare ability, by contrast, is the result of combining knowledge, experience, and directed thought into a form that produces results beyond the ordinary. It is this combination that renders a man difficult to replace. The formation of such ability does not occur quickly. It requires the individual to move beyond surface understanding and enter into depth. He must be willing to remain with a subject longer than others, to examine it more thoroughly, and to refine his approach with patience that extends beyond immediate reward. This willingness is uncommon, for most men seek visible progress. They desire evidence that their efforts are producing results, and when such evidence is not immediately present, they abandon the process. They move from one pursuit to another, gathering fragments of knowledge without ever allowing any single area to develop fully. In doing so, they remain broad, but shallow. And what is shallow cannot sustain distinction. The man who forms rare ability takes a different course. He selects a direction not at random, but with consideration and commits to it. He understands that mastery requires time, and that time must be invested without the constant expectation of immediate return. He studies, not merely to know, but to understand. He practices, not merely to perform, but to refine. At first, his efforts may appear no different from those of others. He performs similar tasks, engages in similar activities, and moves within the same environment. Yet beneath the surface, something different is taking place. His attention is more focused. His thinking is more deliberate. His approach is guided by a desire to improve, not merely to complete. This difference, though not immediately visible, is significant. For it is in these early stages that the foundation of rare ability is laid. Thomas Edison, whose name is now associated with invention and persistence, did not arrive at his results through a single moment of brilliance. He engaged in repeated effort, often encountering outcomes that others would have considered failure. Yet he did not interpret these outcomes as final. He saw them as information, as steps in a process that required continuation. His ability was not the result of isolated success, but of sustained engagement. Each attempt, each adjustment, each refinement contributed to a growing understanding. Over time, this understanding became a capability that others could not easily match. It was not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked persistence in the same direction. This persistence is a defining element of rare ability. It is not the persistence of blind repetition, but the persistence of thoughtful refinement. The individual does not merely repeat the same action, he improves it. He examines what works, what does not, and why. He adjusts, adapts, and continues. Through this process, his skill begins to transform. What was once effortful becomes more natural. What once required concentration becomes more intuitive. He begins to see patterns where others see isolated events. He anticipates outcomes where others react to them. This transformation is gradual, yet powerful. It marks the shift from competence to distinction. At this stage, the individual begins to notice changes in how his work is received. Where once his efforts were viewed as routine, they are now seen as reliable. Where once his contributions were interchangeable, they are now recognized as specific to him. Others begin to associate his presence with a certain standard, a certain level of quality that is not easily reproduced. This association is the beginning of dependence, not dependence in the sense of limitation, but in the sense of value. Others come to rely upon what he provides, not because they are unable to perform the same tasks, but because they recognize that his approach produces results that differ in quality. This recognition increases his standing. He is no longer one who participates, he becomes one who contributes in a manner that shapes outcomes. His role expands, not through demand, but through demonstration. He is given greater responsibility, greater trust, and greater opportunity, for his ability has proven itself through consistent application. Yet even at this stage, the process must continue, for rare ability is not fixed. It must be maintained, strengthened, and expanded. The individual must guard against complacency, for the moment he ceases to refine, he begins to decline. What was once rare may become common if it is not continually developed. This is why repetition remains essential. Not repetition of action alone, but repetition of improvement. Each cycle of effort must build upon the last. Each experience must contribute to greater understanding. The individual must remain a student of his own work, observing, adjusting, and advancing. This continuous refinement produces a compounding effect. The difference between his ability and that of others becomes more pronounced over time. What once appeared as a small advantage grows into a significant separation. And as this separation increases, so too does his value. Others begin to seek him, not for what he does, but for how he does it. They recognize that his approach carries insight, that his execution carries precision, and that his results carry consistency. He becomes a point of reference, a standard by which others measure their own efforts. This position is not achieved through declaration. It is earned through development. The man who occupies it does not claim distinction, he demonstrates it. It is also in this stage that the individual begins to experience a shift within himself. He no longer questions whether he has something of value to offer. He knows it, not through assumption, but through evidence. He has seen the results of his refinement. He has observed the difference in his work. He has experienced the recognition that follows. This knowledge produces a quiet confidence, not the confidence that seeks attention, but the confidence that remains steady regardless of it. It is grounded in ability, not in opinion. It is sustained by performance, not by praise. Others will sense this confidence. They will observe that he moves with assurance, that he approaches challenges with composure, and that he delivers results with consistency. And in this observation, they will place greater trust in him. This trust further increases his value, for value is not determined solely by ability, but by the reliability of that ability. The man who can produce results once is noted. The man who can produce them consistently is valued, and the man who continues to improve upon them becomes indispensable. This is the culmination of rare ability. It is not a fixed point, but a continuing ascent. It is the result of deliberate effort, sustained over time, guided by thought, and reinforced by repetition. And so, let the individual understand that distinction is within his reach, not through sudden change, but through steady development. Let him commit to depth where others remain on the surface. Let him persist where others withdraw. Let him refine where others repeat. And let him affirm with quiet determination. Through persistence, thought, and refinement, I am shaping within myself an ability that grows in value with each passing day, and which cannot be easily replaced. There comes a stage in the advancement of every individual where he must recognize a truth that is seldom taught, yet universally applied. That thought, when properly directed, is the most valuable form of capital he may possess. It is not visible, it cannot be measured in physical terms, yet it determines the quality of all that is produced. Most men expend their effort upon action without first examining the thought that precedes it. They respond to conditions, complete tasks, and fulfill expectations, yet give little attention to the origin of their actions. They do not ask whether their thinking is creating advantage or merely maintaining repetition, and so they remain bound to effort. For action without directed thought is limited to what has already been done. It repeats patterns, follows instruction, and produces results that mirror those of others who have taken the same approach. It may be efficient, but it is not distinctive. The man who learns to direct his thought rises beyond this limitation. He begins to understand that every condition may be influenced by the way in which it is approached. He sees that problems are not fixed obstacles, but situations awaiting interpretation. He recognizes that within each circumstance lies the possibility of improvement, if only he will consider it deeply enough. This consideration requires attention, and attention, when sustained, produces insight. It is not the man who thinks briefly who gains advantage, but the man who remains with a problem longer than others, examining it from different angles, questioning its structure, and seeking a solution that has not yet been made obvious. This is the beginning of intellectual capital. Napoleon Hill himself devoted years to the study of successful individuals, not merely observing what they did, but seeking to understand how they thought. He discovered that their actions, though varied, were guided by a common principle. They directed their thinking with intention. They did not allow their minds to wander aimlessly. They focused repeatedly upon definite aims. From this focus came ideas, and from these ideas came results. The individual who adopts this principle begins to notice a change in his own work. He no longer approaches tasks as isolated requirements, but as opportunities for improvement. He asks not only what must be done, but how may this be done better? This question, when pursued consistently, produces advancement. For improvement is rarely the result of sudden invention. It is more often the result of careful observation, followed by thoughtful adjustment. A slight refinement here, a new arrangement there, a different sequence of action, these small changes, guided by thought, accumulate into significant advantage. Yet such thought does not arise in a distracted mind. The modern tendency toward constant interruption, toward divided attention, prevents the formation of deep thinking. The mind that is continually shifting from one impression to another cannot sustain the focus required to produce insight. It remains on the surface, reacting rather than creating. The man who would increase his value must therefore guard his attention. He must create periods in which he may think without interruption, in which he may examine his work, his direction, and his methods with clarity. He must resist the pull of constant activity long enough to engage in deliberate thought. This discipline is not easy, for it requires him to step away from immediate action and enter into a quieter, less visible form of work. It demands patience, for the results of thought are not always immediate. Yet it is within this quiet work that the greatest advancements are made. As his thinking becomes more directed, another change begins to occur. He becomes less dependent upon instruction. Where once he required guidance, he now begins to generate it. Where once he followed, he now begins to lead. Not through authority alone, but through the quality of his ideas. Others begin to seek his perspective, not because he holds position, but because he demonstrates understanding. This is the transformation from labor to leadership. It is not marked by title, but by influence. The man who thinks clearly, who sees possibilities where others see limitation, who offers solutions where others offer effort, this man becomes a source of direction. His value increases, not because he does more, but because he contributes something that cannot be easily supplied by another. This contribution is the product of thought, and as it grows, so too does his independence. He is no longer confined to the tasks assigned to him. He begins to shape those tasks. He alters their structure, improves their outcome, and expands their impact. He moves from participation to creation, from execution to design. This movement places him in a different position within any field. He is no longer measured solely by his ability to perform, but by his ability to improve. He is valued not only for what he does, but for how he thinks. And this value, being less common, commands greater recognition. Others will begin to notice that his presence changes outcomes, that when he is involved, matters proceed with greater clarity, that when he offers input, confusion is reduced, that when he directs effort, results improve. This observation leads to trust, and trust leads to opportunity. Opportunity, in this sense, is not granted at random. It is extended to those who demonstrate the capacity to handle it. And capacity, at its highest level, is a function of thought. It is also in this stage that the individual must become aware of the responsibility that accompanies his growing influence. For thought, when directed, carries power. It shapes not only his own actions, but the actions of others who come to rely upon his judgment. He must therefore ensure that his thinking remains aligned with constructive purpose. He must guard against careless conclusions, against assumptions not examined, and against influences that would distort his perception. For the same mind that produces advancement may, if left undirected, produce confusion. This awareness leads to greater discipline. He becomes more selective in what he entertains, more deliberate in what he accepts, and more focused in what he develops. His thinking becomes organized, his ideas more precise, and his actions more effective. As this process continues, the individual begins to experience a new form of confidence. Not the confidence that arises from external validation, but the confidence that comes from internal capability. He trusts his ability to think, to analyze, to adjust, and to create. He knows that regardless of circumstance, he possesses the means to respond effectively. This confidence is enduring, for it is not dependent upon conditions, but upon capacity. Others will sense it. They will recognize that he approaches situations with clarity rather than confusion. with direction rather than hesitation. They will come to rely upon this quality, and in doing so, they will place greater value upon his presence. Thus, the man who once labored without distinction becomes one whose thought directs outcomes. And in this transformation, he moves beyond the limitations of effort alone. He enters a realm where value is multiplied, not by doing more, but by thinking better. And so, let him continue to cultivate this power. Let him guard his attention. Let him direct his thought with purpose. Let him engage in the quiet work of reflection, knowing that within it lies the source of his advancement. And let him affirm with steady conviction, my thoughts are directed with purpose and discipline. Through them, I create value that extends beyond labor, and I shape conditions in my favor. There is a principle which governs the advancement of all men who rise beyond the ordinary, yet it is so simple in its nature that many overlook it. It is the principle of refinement, applied not once, but repeatedly, over time, with patience and intention. For it is not a single act that creates distinction, but the accumulation of many small improvements, each building upon the last. Most men seek improvement in sudden leaps. They desire immediate transformation, visible progress, and rapid advancement. When such results do not appear, they grow discouraged. They conclude that their efforts are insufficient or that their direction is incorrect. And in this conclusion, they abandon the very process that would have produced the result they sought. They fail to understand that value grows quietly. It does not announce itself at the beginning. It forms beneath the surface, in moments that appear ordinary, in efforts that go unnoticed, in repetitions that seem without reward. Yet within these repetitions lies the force that shapes mastery. Repetition, when applied without thought, produces stagnation. But repetition, when applied with awareness, produces refinement. The difference lies not in the action itself, but in the attention brought to it. The man who repeats without reflection remains unchanged. The man who repeats with intention improves with each attempt. He observes, adjusts, and advances, even when the change is too slight to be immediately recognized. This is the discipline that separates the common from the uncommon, for it requires patience. It demands that the individual continue when there is no immediate evidence of progress. It asks him to trust in a process that does not yield instant reward, but which, when sustained, produces results of lasting significance. Consider those who have achieved mastery in any field. They did not arrive at their position through a single act of excellence. They arrived through countless acts of refinement. Each day, they returned to their work, not to repeat what they had already done, but to improve upon it. They made adjustments so small that they might have seemed insignificant in isolation, yet over time, these adjustments accumulated into distinction. This accumulation is the true source of advantage, for while others seek immediate results and abandon their efforts when they do not appear, the one who continues to refine moves steadily forward. His progress may not be visible at first, but it is constant, and because it is constant, it becomes powerful. It is also in this stage that the individual must guard against a subtle danger, the danger of early satisfaction. When a man achieves a level of competence that exceeds that of those around him, he may be tempted to rest. He may conclude that he has reached a sufficient level of ability and that further effort is unnecessary. Yet this conclusion marks the beginning of decline, for what is not refined is eventually replaced. The world does not remain still. Conditions change, expectations evolve,